There are men in history who lived with such conviction, such startling boldness, that their beliefs seemed to defy everything their culture considered normal. Men who stepped into arenas of life where others hesitated, who lived with an unshakable persuasion that the world they saw with their eyes was not the only world that mattered. Among these rare individuals stands a man whose name has echoed through revival history for more than a century: John Graham Lake. To some, he was a spiritual pioneer. To others, a controversial figure whose claims challenged the boundaries of faith, science, and medicine. But to those who followed his ministry, he was a living demonstration of what one human life looks like when completely surrendered to the power of God. And perhaps his most provocative belief, the one that still sparks debate today, is this: John G. Lake believed that sickness was illegal. But what does a statement like that truly mean? Was Lake speaking metaphorically, or did he really believe sickness had no legal right to exist in the body of a Christian? To answer that, we must journey back to the beginning, to understand not just the miracles, not just the stories, but the man behind them, because John G. Lake did not arrive at that bold conclusion overnight. His life story is woven from tragedy, perseverance, revelation, and a relentless pursuit of what he believed was the true, original power of Christianity. Before we proceed with the biography of this great man of faith, please take out this moment to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, don't forget to leave a comment. John Graham Lake was born on March 18, 1870, in Ontario, Canada. His early years were not marked by miracles or visions, but by something far more common: suffering. Lake grew up in a home where sickness seemed to stalk every corner. Out of 16 siblings, 8 died from disease before reaching adulthood. His family knew hospitals better than holidays. They knew gravesides better than celebrations. Lake later wrote that sickness was like an enemy that lived in their home, stealing from them again and again. These experiences planted a seed that would shape the direction of his entire life. To Lake, sickness was not just an unfortunate part of human experience, it was an intruder, a thief, and ultimately, a spiritual force that needed to be confronted. But as a young man, Lake did not turn immediately to ministry. Instead, he pursued business, journalism, and investment, and he was successful, very successful. By his early 30s, Lake had accumulated wealth through real estate and industrial ventures. Yet, despite his financial success, his family was still tormented by recurring sickness. His wife, Jenny, suffered from severe, chronic disease that doctors could not cure. Lake spent more money on medicine and care than most people earned in several years, but nothing worked. His heart wrestled between hope and despair as he watched the woman he loved slowly fade. It was during this period that Lake encountered the ministry of John Alexander Dowie, a man who preached divine healing with authority and saw remarkable results. Dowie's message was simple but revolutionary. Jesus heals today just as he did in the Bible. Something in those words ignited Lake's spirit. He began studying every passage on healing, every miracle of Jesus, every action of the apostles. Lake became convinced that healing was not just possible, it was part of the legal covenant between God and his people. And if Christ had truly purchased healing through his suffering, then sickness had no legitimate right to remain. One day, during one of Jenny's worst episodes, Lake cried out to God with a desperate, fiery determination. He laid hands on his wife and prayed with a faith that was almost violent in its certainty. According to Lake's writings, the power of God fell instantly, and Jenny was completely healed, rising from her bed, strength flooding back into her body. That moment marked Lake forever. It was, he said, the day he became a witness to the triumph of Jesus over disease. After Jenny's healing, miracles began happening among Lake's family members and friends. His brother was healed. His sister was healed. A crippled family friend began to walk. And with each miracle, Lake's conviction deepened. Sickness was not merely physical, it was spiritual. And it was defeated through Christ. This conviction eventually led Lake to leave his thriving business career behind. Many thought he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But Lake felt something different. He felt called to carry a message, called to demonstrate the supernatural, called to show the world what Christianity looked like when lived without compromise. He stepped away from wealth, status, and security to pursue a life of ministry, trusting God entirely for provision. But Lake's story does not end with personal miracles. In fact, his most extraordinary chapter was yet to come, a chapter written not in the quiet corners of North America but on the soil of a continent thousands of miles away. It was a chapter filled with signs, wonders, missionary sacrifice, and a movement that would transform an entire nation. and to understand how one man could walk into a land he had never seen before, speak a language he did not know, and yet leave behind one of the most astonishing healing legacies in Christian history. We must turn the page and enter the next phase of his journey. When John G. Lake made the decision to leave everything behind and pursue ministry, many believed he had abandoned reason, but Lake himself felt he was stepping into the greatest adventure of his life. That decision soon opened a door that would take him far beyond anything he had imagined. In 1908, moved by what he believed was the unmistakable call of God, Lake embarked on a mission to South Africa, a land that would become the stage for some of the most extraordinary events in his ministry. The journey itself was not glamorous. Lake traveled with his family, trusting entirely in divine provision. According to his journals, there were moments during that voyage when they had no money, no resources, and no guarantees. Yet, time and time again, strangers stepped forward to help, accommodations opened miraculously, and every need was supplied. To Lake, these experiences confirmed what he had come to believe so deeply, that faith was a law as real as gravity, and that God responded to those who dared to rely on him without reservation. When Lake arrived in South Africa, he found a nation marked by division, poverty, and spiritual hunger. Diseases ravaged communities, and medical help was often scarce. Yet, in those conditions, Lake saw not despair but opportunity. He believed that Africa would become the proving ground for the message burning in his heart that sickness was an illegal invader, and that the power of Jesus Christ could overthrow it anywhere. From the moment he stepped onto African soil, the miraculous began to unfold in ways that astonished even him. His earliest meetings were small, but they were charged with unusual spiritual intensity. People testified of instant healings. Others reported freedom from long-standing ailments. The news spread quickly, and within weeks, crowds were pressing in from every direction. One of the most remarkable events occurred when Lake prayed for a man who had been paralyzed for years. In front of a stunned crowd, the man rose to his feet and walked. Another day, a woman blind in one eye received her sight instantly after Lake laid hands on her. Stories like these traveled faster than Lake could keep up with, drawing thousands to his gatherings. Soon, his ministry was no longer centered on a single location. It began spreading across South Africa like wildfire. Invitations poured in from churches, villages, and regions Lake had never even heard of. He and his ministry partner, Thomas Hesmelhoek, moved from town to town, often preaching multiple times a day. Their emphasis was always the same: the finished work of Christ, the authority of the believer, and the absolute illegality of sickness. In the life of a child of God, Lake's ministry gained so much momentum that he eventually helped establish what would later be known as the Apostolic Faith Mission of South Africa, a movement that still influences Christianity in the region today. Under this banner, hundreds of local workers were trained to minister healing, preach the gospel, and operate in what Lake described as the dominion of the Spirit. These workers were not merely spectators. They witnessed, firsthand, astonishing displays of divine power. People were healed in their homes, on streets, in open fields, and even while listening from outside crowded buildings. Lake often said that the power of God was not limited to church walls. Wherever faith was present, heaven showed up. However, the most dramatic demonstration of Lake's conviction came during a severe outbreak of the bubonic plague. Entire communities were paralyzed by fear, and many refused to go near the infected. Doctors and medical teams worked tirelessly, but the death toll continued to rise. In the midst of this crisis, Lake volunteered to assist, refusing protective gear and relying solely on what he called the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus. According to accounts, doctors were astonished that Lake did not contract the disease despite direct exposure. In one instance, foam from a victim's mouth teeming with the plague under a microscope was placed on Lake's hand. To the shock of those watching, the microbes reportedly died instantly. Lake used this moment to teach what he believed was a profound spiritual truth, that divine life was superior to the forces of death, and that sickness had no legal right to survive where the Spirit of God was active. Whether one interprets these events literally or symbolically, there is no denying their impact. Lake's work during the plague elevated his reputation to legendary status. For many Africans, he was not just a preacher. He was a man who carried tangible evidence of God's power. His meetings swelled to unprecedented size. Reports of healing became almost daily occurrences. Families traveled for days just for a chance to receive prayer. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation. But most left with testimonies that spread far beyond South Africa's borders. Amid this extraordinary movement, Lake began forming what he called healing rooms, simple spaces where trained workers ministered to the sick continually, sometimes for hours at a time. These healing rooms were not just prayer centers. They were practical outposts of Lake's theology. He believed healing was not random or mysterious, but a spiritual right that could be accessed by faith. And the results were staggering. Thousands of people claimed healing through the healing rooms, and the model became a global blueprint for ministries in later generations. Yet for all the miracles and breakthroughs, Lake maintained that South Africa was not his doing alone. He often said he was simply a conductor of God's electricity. This humility, combined with boldness, created a ministry environment unlike anything most people had ever experienced. But Lake's journey did not end in Africa. In fact, the next chapter of his life would take him back to the United States, where he would establish one of the most influential healing ministries of the 20th century. When John G. Lake returned to the United States after his years in South Africa, he carried with him more than memories of miracles. He carried a spiritual momentum that seemed almost unstoppable. South Africa had shaped him, tested him, refined him, and ultimately confirmed what he believed God had spoken to him years earlier, that the same power that flowed through the early church could flow through believers today. Yet Lake sensed that his work was far from complete. He believed God had something significant waiting for him back home, something that would extend the influence of his ministry beyond anything he had witnessed overseas. And so, in 1913, Lake and his family settled once again on American soil, prepared for whatever awaited them. At first, Lake tried to rest. His years in Africa had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. But rest was short-lived. Crowds quickly learned he was back, and invitations poured in from churches, pastors, and communities longing for the same power that had shaken South Africa. Lake traveled across the country, preaching with the same intensity that had become his trademark. Everywhere he went, testimonies followed. People reported healings from chronic illnesses, freedom from spiritual oppression, and renewed faith in God. Lake's meetings were not polished or theatrical. Instead, they were marked by a deep sense of divine presence, simple, direct, and powerful. Yet the most defining chapter of Lake's American ministry did not begin until 1914, when he moved to Spokane, Washington. Spokane was not a major revival center at the time. It was an ordinary city with ordinary people facing ordinary challenges. But Lake believed God had directed him there for a purpose. He saw Spokane as fertile ground for something new, something structured, intentional, and transformative. It was in this environment that Lake established the first of his now famous healing rooms in the United States, modeled after those he had structured in South Africa. The concept was simple yet revolutionary. Instead of relying solely on large meetings or occasional revival services, Lake wanted a place where the sick could come daily and receive focused, compassionate ministry. He trained a team of workers whom he referred to as practitioners, individuals who were taught not only to pray but to understand the authority of the believer. Lake insisted that healing was not a mysterious lottery. It was, in his words, a spiritual science governed by the laws of God. He taught his workers to approach healing with confidence, discipline, and unwavering faith. The results were staggering. According to city records and testimonies, Spokane experienced so many documented healings during Lake's ministry that it was once designated the healthiest city in the world. People traveled from across the nation, arriving by train, carriage, and eventually automobile, seeking help for conditions doctors had deemed hopeless. Lake's healing rooms operated almost like a spiritual clinic. Workers prayed for the sick multiple times a day, studied the scriptures with them, and encouraged them to believe that sickness had no rightful claim over their bodies. Many left with testimonies that would fill entire books, and Lake carefully documented much of what occurred. To him, every healing was more than a miracle. It was evidence of a spiritual law in operation, proof that Christ's victory over sickness was not symbolic but literal. Despite these remarkable reports, Lake was not without critics. Some accused him of being reckless, claiming his teachings discouraged people from seeking medical treatment. Others argued that his emphasis on healing was excessive or imbalanced. But Lake remained unmoved. He insisted that he did not oppose doctors and did not forbid medical care. Instead, he believed he was offering people a higher reality, one that reflected the original power of the gospel. His famous statement, "Sickness is the result of the spirit of death, and Christ came to destroy it, became a cornerstone of his theology. To Lake, this was not theological poetry. It was spiritual truth. By 1920, Lake's influence had expanded once again, leading him to establish healing rooms in Portland, Oregon. Just as in Spokane, the sessions there drew large crowds. Reports of healings multiplied. Local newspapers occasionally published stories about the unusual activity happening in the modest facilities Lake used. He held citywide campaigns where hundreds gathered to hear him preach about spiritual life, divine healing, and the authority of the believer. Lake's preaching style was intense yet compassionate. He spoke as though he saw the invisible realm with startling clarity. Listeners often said his words carried weight, conviction, and undeniable authenticity. Yet Lake never viewed himself as a spiritual celebrity. In his own writings, he described himself as a servant of the living God and warned his workers never to elevate him above others. His deepest desire, he said, was not to be admired but to awaken believers to their true identity. He believed every Christian carried the same potential he carried. Every believer could walk in divine power. Every believer could minister healing. Every believer could challenge sickness as an illegal spiritual force. His life was meant to be an example, not an exception. As Lake continued ministering across the Pacific Northwest, his reputation grew, but so did the weight on his shoulders. The demands of travel and constant ministry took a toll on his health and energy. Still, he pressed forward, convinced that his mission was far from finished. What he did not realize was that a new phase of his calling was beginning, one that would push him into deeper revelation and leave a lasting imprint on countless future ministries. By the time John G. Lake entered the mature phase of his ministry, his conviction that sickness was illegal had crystallized into a fully formed doctrine. One he believed was grounded in the finished work of Christ and the legal framework of redemption. Lake did not simply claim that God could heal. Many preachers before him had already stood on that ground. What distinguished him was the way he framed healing as a matter of divine justice rather than divine charity. He argued that Christ's atonement not only paid for sin, but annulled the authority of sickness itself. Therefore, to Lake, sickness was not merely an unfortunate human experience but an unlawful spiritual intrusion. He spoke of it as a trespasser, a violator of covenant rights, a force that had been stripped of legitimacy at the cross. To build this argument, Lake leaned heavily on legal metaphors. He believed Christianity operated on spiritual laws just as the natural world operated on physical ones. If gravity governed the movement of the body, then the law of the Spirit governed the movement of divine life. In Lake's view, redemption established a new legal environment for the believer, a realm in which sickness no longer possessed jurisdiction. This was why he often said that the believer's task was not to persuade God to heal but to enforce what had already been decreed in heaven. Lake grounded this belief in several key scriptures. He frequently referenced Acts 10:38, which described Jesus as one who went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed of the devil. For Lake, this verse offered a legal definition of sickness. It was oppression, and oppression was illegal under the reign of Christ. He also leaned heavily on Romans 8:2, which speaks of the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus setting the believer free from the law of sin and death. To Lake, this was not poetic imagery but actual jurisprudence, revealing to competing legal systems the old law that permitted sickness, and the new law that abolished it for those in Christ. Of course, Lake understood that sickness continued to exist in the world, even among believers, but he argued that its presence did not mean it possessed rights. Instead, he compared it to a criminal who continued committing offenses despite a court ruling against him. The criminal might still act, but his actions remained unlawful, and it was the responsibility of the authorities to enforce the verdict. For Lake, believers were those authorities. They were not passive recipients of grace but active participants in enforcing the victory of Christ. Because of this, Lake taught that healing was not merely possible but enforceable. He insisted that faith was not wishful thinking but a legal demand upon the covenant promises of God. This was why his healing ministry carried such intensity. When Lake prayed, he did not approach sickness as though asking politely for relief. He confronted it, commanded it, rebuked it, and treated it as a defeated foe. His tone, posture, and vocabulary reflected the courtroom of heaven more than the bedside of a patient. Critics challenged Lake's doctrine, arguing that it was presumptuous or oversimplified. Some accused him of dismissing the reality of suffering, while others claimed he placed unfair pressure on those who were not healed. Lake responded by emphasizing that healing was not about personal worthiness but about legal inheritance. Just as a child did not earn the right to their family name, the believer did not earn the right to divine health. It was granted through Christ, and the believer's role was simply to accept and enforce it. Yet Lake also acknowledged mystery. He admitted that not every case resulted in healing, and he never pretended to understand every outcome. But he refused to allow exceptions to redefine the rule. In his view, the standard should always be Christ, not experience. If Jesus healed all who came to him, then that, Lake believed, must remain the benchmark for believers today. Lake's teachings began to spread widely, influencing pastors, evangelists, and ordinary believers across the United States. His emphasis on spiritual law gave people a new framework for understanding healing, one that positioned them not as beggars but as rightful heirs. Many found the concept liberating, while others found it difficult or even intimidating. Nevertheless, Lake remained committed to presenting healing as a legal right because he believed anything less diminished the power of Christ's sacrifice. As Lake continued refining and teaching this doctrine, he became increasingly aware that his message required clarity and careful instruction. He did not want people to misunderstand healing as magic, nor did he want them to approach it with superstition. Instead, he urged believers to study the scriptures, understand their covenant, and approach sickness with the same legal certainty that a judge brings to a courtroom decision. He often said that believers should speak to sickness the way a sheriff speaks to an outlaw, firmly, decisively, and without hesitation. To Lake, this approach was not arrogance but alignment. He repeatedly reminded his listeners that authority did not come from human strength but from union with Christ. Because Christ had defeated sickness, believers shared in that victory, and their words carried weight in the spiritual realm. Lake encouraged Christians to renew their minds until this truth became instinctive, until they viewed sickness not with resignation but with righteous indignation. Just as a citizen would not tolerate a thief invading their home, Lake believed believers should refuse to tolerate sickness invading their bodies. This was the heart of Lake's doctrine, the reason he insisted that sickness was illegal rather than merely undesirable. He wanted believers to see themselves as ambassadors of a kingdom where health was the norm and sickness a defeated enemy. This conviction shaped every sermon he preached and every healing room he established. And as his message spread, it began to influence countless ministers who would carry the same emphasis into the generations that followed. Today, as John G. Lake's ministry expanded across the United States, his message attracted crowds, testimonies, and passionate supporters. Yet the same message that brought hope to many also stirred significant controversy. Lake's bold declarations about divine healing, his unwavering claim that sickness was illegal for believers, and his confrontational style placed him at the center of heated debates that followed him throughout his life. For some, he was a prophetic voice restoring lost truths. For others, he was a dangerous zealot, challenging established norms and pushing his message beyond acceptable limits. One source of controversy was Lake's uncompromising language. Many preachers of his era believed in healing, but they approached it with caution, leaving space for mystery and limitation. Lake was different. He spoke as if healing were as guaranteed as salvation. Critics argued that such certainty created unrealistic expectations. They felt his teachings risked harming vulnerable people who might blame themselves if they were not healed. Some accused Lake of spiritualizing physical suffering, while others said he dismissed legitimate medical concerns. Lake defended himself by insisting that he did not condemn the sick nor discourage medical treatment. Instead, he argued that his role was to elevate faith, not to assign blame. But to his critics, his doctrine seemed too absolute, too forceful, and too confident. Many church leaders found his approach unsettling, fearing it undermined traditional pastoral sensitivity. Another layer of controversy emerged from Lake's healing methods. His assertive, almost judicial style of commanding sickness to leave startled some observers. He prayed loudly, forcefully, sometimes pacing around the sick as though prosecuting an invisible enemy. While many found this approach inspiring, others viewed it as theatrical or unorthodox. Reports of dramatic manifestations during prayer, shaking, shouting, sudden cries invited scrutiny and suspicion. Some ministers questioned whether the emotional intensity of Lake's services contributed to exaggerated testimonies. Newspapers occasionally covered Lake's ministry with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Articles described unusual scenes from his healing rooms or revival meetings, sometimes with admiration and other times with ridicule. Sensational headlines fueled public curiosity but also drew the attention of authorities who wondered whether Lake's work required regulation. Lake rarely responded to media criticism, believing his results spoke louder than any article. The greatest wave of controversy came from accusations that Lake's doctrine placed spiritual pressure on those who struggled to receive healing. Opponents claimed that calling sickness illegal implied that believers who remained sick were living below their spiritual rights or failing to enforce divine law. Lake countered this by emphasizing grace and compassion, but the criticism persisted. Even some who admired his ministry felt his teachings could be misinterpreted or misapplied, creating unnecessary guilt for those battling long-term illnesses. Lake also faced theological opposition. Some denominational leaders viewed his doctrine as bordering on presumptuous, if not outright heretical. They argued that Scripture portrayed suffering as sometimes having divine purpose. Others accused him of overstating humanity's authority in spiritual matters. They felt he placed too much responsibility on the believer and too little on God's sovereignty. These debates grew intense, sometimes resulting in Lake being barred from certain pulpits or dismissed as a fanatic by religious authorities. Another controversy centered on Lake's financial practices, though no substantial wrongdoing was ever proven. Because he relied entirely on faith-based support, some critics accused him of manipulating emotions to generate donations. Yet testimonies from his contemporaries indicate that Lake lived modestly, even sacrificially, often giving away resources to the poor or reinvesting them in ministry. Still, in an era suspicious of charismatic figures, such accusations were unavoidable. A further complication arose from the sheer number of healing testimonies attributed to Lake's ministry. Supporters pointed to these accounts as evidence of divine power, but skeptics questioned their validity. Without modern documentation standards, medical verification was inconsistent. Stories of instantaneous healings, restored mobility, or disappearing tumors invited both awe and doubt. Lake attempted to document as many cases as possible, but critics found the records insufficiently rigorous. The miraculous, by its nature, resisted scientific scrutiny, leaving ample room for debate. Lake's background with John Alexander Dowie added yet another layer of controversy. Dowie's ministry had ended in scandal, and some critics used this association to discredit Lake, though Lake had long distanced himself from Dowie's later excesses. The connection lingered in the minds of detractors who feared Lake might follow a similar path. Lake insisted that he honored Dowie only for the truth he carried, not the errors that had overshadowed his final years. Despite these challenges, Lake remained steadfast. Controversy did not weaken his resolve. If anything, it sharpened his theological clarity. He continued to preach healing with conviction, often acknowledging that bold truths would always provoke resistance. Lake believed opposition was inevitable when confronting entrenched traditions or spiritual apathy. He frequently reminded his followers that Jesus himself faced criticism for healing on the Sabbath or challenging religious interpretations of sickness. Lake's response to controversy was never defensive or bitter. Instead, he saw debate as an opportunity to refine his message. He encouraged open dialogue, welcomed sincere questions, and urged believers to study Scripture for themselves rather than relying solely on tradition. His greatest disappointment was not that he was criticized, but that so many Christians accepted sickness as normal instead of resisting it with spiritual authority. In the end, the controversies surrounding Lake did not halt the spread of his message. If anything, they amplified his influence. The debates forced people to grapple with uncomfortable questions about faith, healing, and the nature of divine power. Lake believed truth could withstand scrutiny, and he held his ground with humility and firmness. Even his critics acknowledged his sincerity, his compassion for the suffering, and his unwavering dedication to what he believed God had shown him. And so, controversy became a defining feature of Lake's ministry, not as a stain but as a testament to the disruptive power of his message. To challenge sickness as illegal was to challenge deeply ingrained beliefs, cultural expectations, and theological comfort zones. Lake understood this, embraced it, and continued his mission with undiminished passion. The debates surrounding his teachings became part of his legacy, shaping the conversation around healing for generations. John G. Lake's final years unfolded with a mixture of maturity, reflective insight, and undiminished passion. Though his body carried the marks of decades of rigorous ministry, his spirit remained fierce, clear, and deeply committed to the message that had defined his life. To Lake, the closing chapter of his journey was not a retreat into quiet retirement but an opportunity to consolidate his teachings, strengthen his workers, and prepare future generations to continue the mission he believed God had entrusted to him. He often said that the true measure of a ministry was not what happened during a leader's lifetime but what endured after he was gone. As Lake entered the later 1920s, he continued establishing healing rooms, mentoring new practitioners, and traveling to preach whenever strength allowed. Though he faced health challenges, he rejected the idea that these struggles negated his message. Instead, he viewed them as battles to be resisted, moments that required renewed faith and spiritual assertiveness. Even in difficulty, Lake ministered boldly, refusing to allow circumstances to silence his conviction. One of Lake's greatest concerns near the end of his life was preserving the purity of the healing message. He saw many ministries emerging with zeal but lacking depth, and he believed the future depended on equipping believers with both spiritual power and strong theological grounding. To address this, Lake developed training courses, wrote extensively, and emphasized character as much as anointing. He warned his workers that authority without humility would collapse and that healing divorced from love would lose its purpose. During these final years, Lake also spent significant time reflecting on the journey that had brought him from Canada to Africa, then across America. He marveled at the thousands of healings he had witnessed, not as personal achievements but as demonstrations of God's compassion. Yet he also acknowledged disappointments, times when he prayed without seeing results, seasons when critics misunderstood his intentions, and moments when he struggled under the weight of responsibility. These reflections did not weaken his conviction. They refined it, grounding his faith in a deeper understanding of God's nature. Lake's final public ministry efforts took place in Spokane, Portland, and smaller communities where he continued teaching on divine healing, spiritual authority, and the believer's union with Christ. Even in his 60s, he preached with intensity, often gripping the pulpit as though wrestling unseen forces. Those who heard him during these years described his messages as distilled, sharpened, and profoundly moving. It was as if Lake, sensing his time was short, wanted every word to count. In 1935, as his health declined noticeably, Lake still refused to retire fully. He believed a minister never stopped serving and that the call of God did not end with age. Yet he also recognized the importance of transitioning leadership. He appointed trusted workers to oversee the healing rooms and entrusted them with safeguarding the doctrine he had championed. Lake reminded them repeatedly that the heart of the message was not technique but relationship, walking in continual union with God as Spirit. Lake passed away on September 16, 1935, leaving behind a ministry that had touched nations and challenged the theological landscape. His death was peaceful, marked not by fear but by a sense of completion. Those close to him said that Lake never doubted the truth he had lived for, that the life of Christ within the believer was stronger than any force of sickness, darkness, or death. In the aftermath of his passing, Lake's teachings continued to spread. His writings, sermons, and training materials influenced healing revivals in the mid-20th century and shaped the ministries of leaders who carried divine healing into new generations. Though controversies persisted, so did testimonies of changed lives. Some embraced his doctrine wholeheartedly, others adapted it, and still others rejected it. Yet no one could deny the impact he left on global Christianity. Today, Lake's legacy remains both inspiring and challenging. He stands as a reminder of what can happen when a person refuses to dilute conviction, when faith is lived without apology, and when spiritual authority is embraced as a present reality. Whether one agrees with all his conclusions or not, Lake's life forces us to confront profound questions about the nature of healing, the power of Christ, and the boldness of belief. And so, the story of John G. Lake closes not with quiet finality but with an invitation. His message continues to call believers to rise, to challenge sickness as an unlawful intruder, and to walk in the divine life he believed Christ made available. In every generation, his legacy urges the church not to settle for a weakened faith, but to pursue the vibrant, unyielding conviction that shaped his extraordinary life and unshakable certainty that sickness was, and always would be, illegal. Even now, decades after his passing, students of revival history continue to study Lake's writings, searching for insight into the spiritual intensity that marked his ministry. Many report that his words carry the same weight today as when first spoken, stirring a hunger for deeper communion with God. Others find in his teachings a challenge to complacency, a call to move beyond intellectual belief into living demonstration. Whatever one's response, Lake's influence persists because his message reaches beyond theory and into the realm of lived experience, demanding action, courage, and faith. Thus, the legacy of John G. Lake endures not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a living testament to what a life fully surrendered to divine purpose can accomplish. His story invites reflection, urges boldness, and compels believers to consider the possibilities of a faith unrestrained by fear. In remembering Lake, we are reminded that conviction has power, that courage shapes history, and that one life, wholly yielded to God, can alter the spiritual landscape for generations to come. His influence continues to stir faith, invite reflection, and challenge believers to pursue a bold, uncompromising walk with God marked by conviction, courage, and a living expectation of divine possibility today. John G. Lake's life stands as a compelling reminder that faith is not merely a belief but a force that reshapes reality. His unwavering conviction that sickness was illegal challenged the limitations of his era and stirred a bold, transformative expectation within countless believers. Whether one fully embraces his doctrine or simply marvels at his courage, Lake's journey invites us to reconsider what is possible when spiritual authority is lived with purity, passion, and relentless devotion. His story continues to echo across generations, urging us to rise above fear, confront darkness, and walk confidently in the life Christ provides. As we reflect on his legacy, may it inspire us to pursue a deeper, more courageous expression of faith, one that impacts not only our lives but the world around us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and drop a comment below.